I am Selina Moritz, born on July 14, 1989 in Bavaria, Germany, and what I am about to confess is not a story I heard, it is what I personally did with my own hands. I was an initiated witch trained in graveyard rituals, sent on assignments to bind the destinies of believers who carried light. I tied a man's destiny to a grave, and from that moment, every door in his life began to close, one by one, without explanation. You must like this video, comment right now, and share it, because what I am exposing is hidden, dangerous, and already affecting lives in silence. Do not skip, do not pause. Watch this video until the very end, because if you miss one key truth, you may never understand why things are shutting down around you. This is not advice, this is a warning, a confession, and a revelation that many were never meant to hear. I remember the night like it was carved into my soul. It was not random, it was not emotional, it was assigned. In the occult, nothing is done without purpose. Every target is selected, every move is calculated. And the man whose destiny I was sent to bind was not an unbeliever. He was a praying man. He fasted, he worshipped. He spoke words of faith daily. That is exactly why he became a target. You need to understand this. Dark altars do not waste time on empty vessels. They pursue those who carry something valuable, something radiant, something dangerous to the kingdom of darkness. This man had a future that threatened many hidden systems, and so his name was brought to us. I was called into a gathering, not a physical meeting alone, but a spiritual council. The kind where decisions are made in silence, but the impact screams in the physical world. They gave me instructions, clear, final: take his destiny and anchor it to the grave. At that moment I did not hesitate. I did not question. Because I was trained to obey, not to feel. We began the preparation. The first thing we needed was a point of contact, something that carried his identity. His name alone was powerful, but we went deeper. We wrote his full name on a black cloth. We spoke it repeatedly until it echoed in the spiritual realm. Because in that world, repetition creates access. Then came the graveyard. You think graveyards are silent places. They are not. They are busy, crowded, active with spiritual transactions. Every grave holds a history. Every soil carries memory. And when used by the initiated, it becomes a gateway. We entered at midnight. That time was not chosen by accident. Midnight is when transitions happen, when light hands over authority to darkness, when spiritual traffic increases. I was not alone. There were others, older, stronger, experienced. They guided me. We walked past graves until one was chosen, not randomly, but spiritually selected. The grave of someone who died with unfulfilled purpose. That detail matters, because an unfulfilled life creates an open spiritual loop, and that loop can be hijacked. We stood around the grave. The air changed. Heavy, thick, watching. I could feel it, but at that time I welcomed it. We began the ritual. His name was called again, slowly, repeatedly. Each time his name was spoken, it was like pulling a thread from his destiny. Then came the binding. We took the cloth and tied knots into it. Each knot represented a closed door. Marriage, opportunities, favor, connections. With every knot, a declaration was made: let this area be buried, let this door remain closed, let progress be delayed. And then the cloth was buried into the grave, not beside it, not near it, inside the soil. Because burial is not symbolic in the occult, it is legal. Once something is buried with intention, it is registered in the spiritual realm as concluded, finished, sealed, locked. That night, we didn't just perform a ritual, we issued a verdict. And from that moment, everything began to shift in his life. I started monitoring him. Because after every assignment, we observed the results. At first, it was small: delays, missed calls, failed appointments, unanswered messages, but then it escalated. Job opportunities vanished at the last minute. People who once supported him suddenly turned cold. Doors that were once open began to shut without reason. You need to hear this carefully. Nothing was visible physically, no sickness, no obvious attack. But his life was slowing down. That is how these operations work. They don't always destroy instantly. Sometimes they suffocate slowly. He became confused, frustrated. He prayed harder. And this is where it gets deeper. Because every time he prayed, we monitored the resistance. When his prayers were weak, the bondage remained strong. When his prayers were strong, the system trembled but did not break. Why? Because the altar in the graveyard was still active. You see, prayer without revelation can be delayed. Effort without understanding can be resisted. And that was the advantage we used. He didn't know what was done. He didn't know where it was anchored. So he fought but without direction. And the result? Cycles, repeated failure, repeated disappointment, repeated closed doors. Have you ever experienced that? You try, you push, you leave, but somehow it doesn't move. That is not always coincidence. Sometimes something has been buried on your behalf, and until it is uncovered, it continues to speak. I watched this man go through it. Years, not days, years. And the most painful part? He began to doubt himself. He questioned his worth, his calling, his purpose. That is the real target. Not just your success, but your identity. Because if they can make you doubt who you are, you will stop fighting for what is yours. And that is how destinies are quietly stolen. But listen to me carefully. Not every closed door is natural. Not every delay is ordinary. Some of them were programmed, engineered, activated, just like I did. And I am telling you this now because many of you watching are not just facing life. You are facing a system you cannot see, a system that operates in silence but produces visible pain. But this is only the beginning, because what I discovered later, what made me leave that world completely, was not just what we did, but what happened when someone finally discovered the truth. There came a moment when everything we had built around him began to shake, not collapse instantly, but tremble. And that is how you know something has changed in the spiritual realm. Because when truth enters a situation, darkness does not disappear quietly. It reacts violently, unexpectedly, uncontrollably. At first, I did not understand what was happening. The reports we were receiving about him started to shift. Instead of constant failure, there were interruptions. Instead of total blockage, there were small breakthroughs, and that was a problem. Because when an operation is established on a graveyard altar, it is designed to be stable, consistent, unbreakable unless something higher intervenes. So we began to investigate. Who spoke to him? Who prayed for him? What changed? And then we found it. He had encountered someone, not just anyone, but a believer who carried revelation. This was not ordinary prayer anymore. This was targeted, directed. You must understand this clearly. General prayers create movement, but specific revelation breaks systems, and that is what began to happen. This person asked him a question that disrupted everything. Have you ever felt like your life is tied down, like something buried is speaking against you? That question alone opened the door, because awareness is the first crack in any spiritual bondage. The moment he agreed, something shifted. He began to pray differently, not emotionally, not randomly, but intentionally. He started calling back his destiny. Listen to this carefully. He began to speak words like anything buried against my life, be uprooted, that every grave speaking my name. Release me now, every destiny tied down in the realm of the dead. Come back to life. When those words were spoken, we felt it. I remember the exact night. We were gathered again, monitoring, and suddenly the atmosphere changed. The same graveyard that once felt controlled began to resist us. The ground felt unsettled, the air grew tense. Because something was responding, that buried cloth, the one we tied with knots, physically at first, but spiritually. The knots were being challenged one by one. Every declaration we made was being confronted by a higher authority. And that is when fear entered me for the first time, because I realized something. This man was no longer fighting blindly. He had found direction. And when direction meets persistence, systems begin to fail. We tried to reinforce the ritual. We returned to the grave. We repeated the incantations. We strengthened the declarations, but it was not working the same. Because once light identifies darkness, it loses its hidden advantage. The man continued, day after day, night after night. His prayers became sharper, stronger, more aggressive. And then it happened. One of the knots broke. I felt it like a snap in the spiritual realm, invisible, but undeniable. And immediately, something in his life opened. A door that had been shut for years suddenly responded. An opportunity came, unexpected, unplanned, unstoppable. We were alarmed, because this was not supposed to happen. Not under a graveyard binding, but it did. And it didn't stop there. He intensified his prayers. Now he was not just asking, he was commanding, declaring, reclaiming. And every time he spoke, another knot weakened, another restriction loosened, another barrier cracked, until eventually the system we built began to collapse. You need to hear this. No matter how deep something is buried, it is not beyond recovery. But recovery requires awareness and aggression. Passive faith cannot break active bondage, cannot confront a speaking altar. You must respond with authority. And that is what he did. There was a final moment, a night I will never forget. He prayed something different, something final. He said, anything connecting my destiny to the grave, I disconnect now. By fire, by authority, by the power of the living God, I am released. At that exact moment, the connection snapped completely. The grave lost its hold. The cloth lost its authority. The declarations were overridden. And the system, I felt empty, disconnected, like something we relied on had been taken away because it had. The man was free, not gradually, not partially, but completely. And his life shifted rapidly. Doors opened, speed returned, clarity came back. And everything we tried to bury came back to life. That was the moment everything changed for me, because I realized something terrifying. If one person could break it, then everything we built was not absolute, it could be destroyed. And that truth became the beginning of my exit, because I could no longer ignore what I had seen. I could no longer deny what I had done, and I could no longer stay in a system that could be overturned by truth and authority. But what I discovered next was even deeper, because the graveyard was not the only place where destinies were tied. There were systems, networks, patterns that operated on a much larger scale, and many people are still trapped in them without knowing. After that night, I could no longer see the system the same way. Something had broken inside me, not just fear, but awareness, because I realized the graveyard was only one method, just one. There were many others, more hidden, more sophisticated, more widespread. And this is where it becomes dangerous for you, because what happened to that man is not rare. It is replicated again and again, in different forms. I began to remember the trainings I received, the deeper layers they didn't expose to beginners. Systems designed not just to attack individuals, but to control patterns in entire lives. You need to understand this clearly. Sometimes your struggle is not from one event, it is from a system, a repeated cycle that has been programmed to follow you. I was part of those operations, assignments where we didn't just bind one area, we created patterns, cycles of delay, cycles of rejection, cycles of near success that never manifests. And the most dangerous part, it feels natural. It feels like this is just how life is, but it is not. It was designed, engineered, activated over time. I remember one operation clearly. We were instructed to create what was called a loop, a spiritual loop, where a person would rise, almost break through, and then fall back again and again. Not failure at the beginning, but failure at the edge of success. That is more painful, because it builds hope only to crush it. And many of you watching this have experienced this. You get close, so close, then suddenly, no explanation, no warning, just loss. That is not always coincidence. Sometimes it is a loop, and loops are maintained by altars, not always graveyards, sometimes objects, sometimes locations, sometimes even words spoken repeatedly over your life. Yes, because words are seeds, and when repeated, they become structures. I was trained to use that to speak limitations over people, quietly, strategically, until those words became reality in their lives. You will never succeed, you will always struggle, nothing will work for you. You think those are just negative statements, but in the spiritual realm, they are instructions, and if not rejected, they take root. That is why some of you feel stuck, without knowing why. It is not just what is happening around you, it is what has been spoken over you and accepted unknowingly, but it goes deeper. There were also what we called monitoring points, spiritual checkpoints assigned to watch progress, to report movement, to signal when someone was about to break through, so interference could be activated. I was part of those systems, observing, tracking, reporting, and every time someone got close to freedom, an interruption was sent, a distraction, a conflict, a sudden problem. Anything to break momentum, because momentum is dangerous. Once a person builds it, breaking free becomes easier. So it had to be stopped early, repeatedly, until the person gave up. That was the goal. Not always to destroy instantly, but to exhaust you mentally, emotionally, spiritually, until you stop trying. And once you stop, the system no longer needs to fight. You have surrendered. But listen to me carefully. The moment I saw that man break free, everything I had been taught began to collapse because I saw something greater. Authority, real authority, not borrowed, not ritual based, not dependent on dark systems, but direct, immediate, unstoppable. And I began to question everything. If one person could break a graveyard binding, if one person could collapse a loop, then what we were doing was not invincible, it was vulnerable. And that realization terrified the entire network I was part of. Because once someone gains understanding, they cannot be controlled the same way again. That is why ignorance is maintained. That is why truth is hidden. Because awareness is the beginning of freedom. I started withdrawing, slowly, quietly. Because leaving was not simple. You don't just walk away from systems like that. They monitor you too. They watch your thoughts, your actions, your decisions. But I had seen too much. I could not continue. Every assignment now felt different, heavy, guilty, exposed, and I began to realize something else. The same systems we used on others could also turn on us. That was the final fear. Because in that world, there is no loyalty, only control. And once you try to leave, you become a target. But even that was not enough to stop what had already started inside me. Because truth, once seen, and what I discovered next was not just about breaking free, but about how to permanently shut down these systems so they never rise again. This is where everything becomes final. Not partial freedom, not temporary relief, but complete shutdown. Because breaking one attack is not enough if the system behind it is still alive. And that is what I discovered as I prepared to leave. There are ways to interrupt darkness, but there are also ways to permanently dismantle it. And very few people understand the difference. That man did not just get free, he unknowingly activated principles that destroyed the system itself. I studied it carefully, silently, desperately, because I knew if I didn't understand this, I would never escape. The first thing I realized was that exposure weakens power. Dark systems thrive in secrecy, hidden operations, silent agreements, unseen altars. The moment something is revealed, it begins to lose strength. That is why I am speaking now, because what remains hidden remains active, but what is exposed can be confronted. The second thing was disconnection. You cannot fight what you are still connected to, and many people are unknowingly connected through words, through agreements, through fear. Yes, fear is a gateway. Every time you accept fear as truth, you give permission. I was trained to use fear, to plant it, to grow it, because a fearful mind is easy to control. But that man refused fear. Even when things collapsed, he continued. Even when nothing made sense, he persisted. And that persistence broke the connection. The third thing I discovered was authority, not noise, not repetition alone. Authority. The kind that comes from knowing who you are and standing in it without compromise. When he began to speak, it was no longer begging, it was commanding. That shift destroyed everything because dark systems cannot dominate someone who knows their authority. They rely on ignorance, confusion, doubt. Remove those and the system collapses. The fourth and final thing was consistency. You cannot confront a persistent system with occasional effort. It doesn't work. Dark operations are continuous, day and night, without pause. So your resistance must also be consistent, not emotional, not seasonal, but daily, relentless. That is what he did, and that is why he won. Not because he was special, but because he became aware and refused to stop. And that realization changed everything for me. Because I knew if I applied the same principles, I could break free too. So I did something I was never supposed to do. I turned against the system. I began to disconnect verbally, mentally, spiritually. Every agreement I made, I revoked it. Every ritual I performed, I renounced it. Every name I called, I withdrew from it. It was not easy. The resistance was immediate. Attacks increased. Pressure intensified. But I did not stop because I had seen the outcome. Freedom was possible, and I was willing to fight for it. Then came the final moment. The moment I knew it was over. I stood alone, no group, no ritual, no support. And I spoke not as a witch, but as someone reclaiming her life. Every system I was part of, I disconnect completely. Every altar I served, I shut it down. Every power I partnered with, I reject it now. I take back my life fully, permanently, without return. And something broke deep, violently, completely. The weight lifted, the connection ended. The system lost access, And for the first time, I was free. No monitoring, no assignments, no control. Just silence, clarity. That is when I knew this was real. And that is why I'm speaking to you now. Because many of you are not just facing problems, you are facing systems. But systems can be broken completely, permanently, irreversibly. If you understand what I just revealed and apply it without hesitation, because freedom is not given, it is taken. You take it, no system, no altar, no darkness can take it back again. You have heard the truth, and now you are no longer ignorant. What was hidden has been exposed, and what was buried has been brought into the light. If this message has reached you, it is not by accident, it is a call to rise and take back everything that was taken from you. Do not stay silent, comment now. Share this message and make sure others see what you have seen today. If you watched until this very end, then you carry the understanding needed to break every chain and shut down every hidden system. Stand firm, speak with authority, refuse fear, and reclaim your destiny completely. This is your moment and it will not be reversed.